It was the 90s when this story happened. I was in the fifth grade, and our school had organized for us to spend the first few days of summer break at a sleepaway camp. Back then, those little trips felt like the biggest deal of the world. You know the type: canvas tents set up in rows, hot meals served under a sagging top, and the vague promise of scary stories and s'mores after dinner. We were staying at a bushland site, trees surrounding us from all sides. It was the kind of setting where the night was pitch black and every sound outside the tent made your imagination run wild. I wasn't exactly the adventurous type. I was anxious, quiet and timid, never one to break rules or stray too far from the group. So when I woke up in the middle of the night needing to pee, I tried to hold it in. But the night was long, and when nature calls, sometimes you just have to respond. The toilet block wasn't far, maybe 30 meters away, and I could see it clearly from the tent flap. I didn't even need a torch. I crept out of the tent, zipped it quietly behind me, and made my way toward the toilet. The camp was dark, but not scary. There were no animals, no bugs, just the cold air against my skin and the crunch of gravel under my feet. But it was on my way back that I saw him. At first, I thought it was one of the teachers. He was a tall, broad man with a cap on, standing near one of the boys' tents, holding a torch. He wasn't looking around or patrolling. Instead, he was deliberately shining the beam sideways, not inside the tent, but along the outer canvas wall, like slowly making silhouettes appear on the inside. It was a bit odd. He wasn't checking on the kids or anything. They weren't even aware of his presence, I believed. Instead, he just stood there, watching their shadows. When he noticed me approaching, he quickly turned the lights off and took a few steps back. I expected him to walk off or say something, maybe ask what I was doing out of the tent. But he didn't. He didn't even look like he cared. He just stepped into the shadows, lingering at the edge of the trees, making himself even less visible than he already was. I was frozen for a second, but then did what timid boys do best. I assumed it was my fault. I thought I was in trouble, that maybe I wasn't supposed to be alone at night, and this was some kind of security guard patrolling the grounds. I practically jogged back to my tent, zipped it up, and crawled inside, and I lay there, wide eyed, with heart pounding. I kept waiting for someone to call me out, drag me to a teacher, to yell at me or have me punished, but nothing happened. Instead, a soft, shifting glow slowly dragged across the canvas of my tent. I could hear gravel shifting under boots. I sat up as quietly as possible and pressed my hands to the canvas wall. The light kept moving, paused for a second, and then moved again. He was still out there. For nearly an hour, I listened to him pacing around the camp, slow footsteps, sometimes stopping. Occasionally, the torch beam would cut across another tent. At some point, I swear I saw his shadow squatting in front of the entrance, and every muscle of my body tensed. But still, I didn't move. I didn't wake anyone. I was too afraid to make noise, afraid I'd draw attention and they'd know it was me out alone in the middle of the night. So I just sat there in the dark, waiting for the moment to pass. By the time morning rolled around, I was a mess. My eyes felt like sandpaper. I barely touched my breakfast. My friends laughed and teased me for looking like a zombie, saying I must have been dreaming about girls or Bigfoot or within the bed. Typical kid stuff. But one of the teachers noticed. She was kind and caring, the type who always smelled like biscuits and wore flowery dresses. She came over after breakfast, and asked if I was feeling ill. I told her no, I just didn't sleep well. She asked why, and that's when I mentioned the security camp guard walking around with a torch. Her face changed instantly. She didn't ask me to repeat myself. She didn't laugh or brush it off. She just went pale and stood up, walking quickly to find one of the male teachers. Within 10 minutes, the staff had gathered near the office building at the front of the camp, whispering in low, tense voices. We weren't told anything directly, but the mood shifted fast. There were no morning hikes or free playtime that day. Instead, we were all kept together, closely supervised, and by the afternoon, we found out the police had been called. Apparently, the camp didn't have security, so no one was supposed to be walking around at night, let alone shining torches into children's tents. It turned out in this part I only learned later, once we were safely home, that a man had been recently released from prison and was living in the nearby forest in a tent of his own. He was a known sex offender, someone the police had been keeping an eye on, but disappeared from their radar just a few weeks ago. He'd apparently been spotted a few times near local campsites, always late at night. He was never caught near ours. He disappeared again shortly after, but the camp shut down for the season not long after that. I think about that night sometimes, about how close he was, and how long he stayed around, about how no one else woke up, or if they did, they too were too scared to say. And I wonder, what was it that he wanted to do, and what changed his mind? This was a few summers ago. My father and I were celebrating my finishing university with a fishing trip to Logan Lake. Not the actual lake, just the municipality. I don't think the lake even had a name, but it was one of those surrounding lakes close by that were less popular for not being family accessible, and more of a private lake in the sense that people couldn't get there without some kind of clearance. We were the only people at the lake the entire time. Anyways, we get there, and the first day passed normally, probably the best fishing we've both ever had in our entire lives. Starting around 4 p.m., we were trolling the shallows, clear water, 4 to 6 feet deep, with a pumpkin head fly, and getting a fish every 5 minutes. Generally, this never happens, especially in an area like that, because the fish can see you clearly. I think we both landed at least 25 fish each by the end of the day. Super glad we brought the two-way roads on this trip. The fish were small, but they were feisty, and the ones we did keep tasted amazing. The second day was more typical fishing for the lake, around 4 fish each over the course of the day. We eat 2 fish each, the limit for the lake, eat some hot dogs, then go to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I wake up feeling alert. At this point, I am a bit irritable because I know I won't be able to fall back asleep for a while, or at all, given how I feel. A few seconds later, I feel this primal fear, like I couldn't move, even if I wanted to. There is this slow, childlike bubbling around the sides of my tent. Every instinct in my body is telling me not to speak or make a sound that might make my presence known. In a way, it sounded like it was trying to communicate something, not in the sense of telling me to leave, but more like trying to get its point across, like being very insistent, similar to a baby being frustrated that its cries out of hunger weren't being handled, or like a cat asking to be fed with mowing. But it sounded unsettling. It's not like it didn't sound like a baby, It's more like it sounded wrong, like it wasn't from this world. And what is a baby doing all by its own, alone, in the middle of nowhere? It didn't even sound like any language I knew or was familiar with. It was more like gibberish, but despite the fact that it sounded like gibberish, it felt like the words had meaning to the being. Something about the speech patterns, or maybe whatever it was saying, that petrified me. The closest comparison I can think of are the dead children from the TV series From. It hadn't come out yet at the time, but I remember when I first started watching it, the ghoul children reminded me of the bubbling I heard that lake, reminded me of the bubbling I heard that summer when they said whatever they were saying. Despite being so scared and feeling so alert, I remember completely passing out after the sound stopped, like it put me to sleep or something. My dad didn't wake up, nor did he hear anything. He was wearing earplugs, and we stayed another night after that against better judgment. But nothing weird happened. Fishing was average the rest of the time, and we left without further incident. The only other notable thing that happened was that every fish we released on the final day was scooped up by two loons. We didn't ever go back there, partially because of my eerie experience, but also partially because I didn't want to taint the memory of back-to-back fish with getting skanked. When I was younger, my parents used to send me to this church summer camp every year. They thought it would be good for me, strengthen my faith, build my character, and all that jazz. I didn't care much for their reasoning, to be honest, but my best friends, Annie and Lucy, were going, so I was happy to tag along. The week went by in a flash, between canoeing, hiking, swimming, and endless rounds of volleyball. We barely had a moment to slow down, and by the time the last day showed up, none of us wanted to leave. The last night of camp always followed the same routine. A huge bonfire in a clearing deep in the woods was the climax of the week. We sat there, sang some songs, then shared our testimonies about how the camp and obviously Jesus changed our lives. Then we'd get a stick and throw it in the fire to represent our newfound devotion to God. After tossing your stick, you were supposed to head straight back to your cabin, no lingering behind, just throw your stick and move along. That night, Lucy got really emotional. She just thrown her stick in, but instead of going back with us, she was pulled by our counselor, who took her to a walk to clear her head. They were too deep in conversation for us to tag along, so Annie and I decided to hang back and wait for her just outside of the circle, just outside of the circle of firelight, sitting under a tree where we could stay out of sight. We had been sitting there, lost in conversation, when we suddenly realized how quiet everything had become. The usual background noise of campers and counselors had faded. Everyone else had slipped away, and Lucy was probably back in the cabin too. Just as we were about to leave, a group of adults emerged from the trees and stepped into the clearing. They were dressed in long, dark cloaks, hoods pulled overhead, and even in the dim firelight, we could make out a few familiar faces. They were our camp leaders, counselors, organizers, and Father Samuel, the leader of the church. Father Samuel stepped into the center of the circle and began praying. His voice was low, and his humming was unrecognizable, as if he was speaking in tongues. The others followed him in syncs and started weeping, their voices rising and falling in unison, following the gestures of his hand. We were frozen just beyond the edge of the firelight, crouched low behind the bushes, barely daring to breathe. Every instinct screamed at us to get up and leave, but we couldn't look away. We knew we shouldn't be there. We knew that if they saw us, we'd be in deep trouble. And yet, despite the fear clawing at our inside, some part of us wanted to see more. And then things took a darker turn. A counselor stepped inside the circle with Father Samuel, and the others started wailing even louder, raising their arms and smacking themselves harder with every weep. The man then took off his cloak and started stripping straight right in front of the fire. And that's when Annie grabbed me by the shoulder and hissed in my ear, "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue, as I was thinking the same. We got up, ran, and didn't dare to look back. It was dark now, and we were no longer close to the fire, and I had multiple branches slapping my face. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. But we didn't stop until we made it back to the cabin, gasping for air, slamming the door behind us. That night, Annie and I curled up under our blanket, clinging to each other in silence. We barely slept. We spent the night hoping no one came after us, and luckily, no one did. By morning, it was like nothing ever happened. No one mentioned the bonfire. No one spoke of the chanting or the strange rituals in the woods. Not the counselors, not the leaders, and definitely not us. When we told Lucy what we saw, she just shook her head and laughed, convinced we must have had a bad dream. And maybe we would have believed that if it weren't for the fear still sitting heavy in our chests. But Lucy adored the church, and she practically worshipped Father Samuel. Of course, she wouldn't believe us. That we understood. Annie and I still talk about it now and then. This wasn't the last time we went to that camp, but it was definitely the last time we ever stayed behind. And after that night, we followed the rules, we stuck to the group, and we never wandered off again. Because out there, beyond the firelight and the deep dark of the woods, you never know what you could find. I was 6 years old when my dad sat me down on his knee, stared deep into my soul, and told me, through beer tinged breath, that God did not exist. This revelation coincided with Christmas, which, now that I think about, was probably just his sleazy way of explaining why I wasn't getting any gifts that year. And that was how I lost religion, while my mother sat by the side, watching her husband indoctrinate me into atheism. A few years later, she would do the same when her new man, a devout Catholic, brought faith back into our household. It started subtly this time, first with inviting strangers from church over for dinner, then attending Sunday worship without fail, and eventually we were saying prayers before every meal. I was 13 by then, and I had already grown to prefer a world where God did not exist. So naturally, I pushed back, and of course, that only made my life harder. Then, one evening, I was told I'd be going on a 2-week church youth retreat to renew my faith, they said, and as you can imagine, I was furious. I had never been to a summer camp at that point, and I couldn't imagine spending half of my break singing god awful songs and listening to repetitive, sleep inducing sermons. The thought of being stuck alone with these preacher's kids, away from my friends, and without any sense of autonomy, made my stomach twist into knots. At first, I pleaded with my mom not to send me, and then I threw a tantrum, kicked and screamed, but that only made them more adamant about my going. So I decided if I couldn't deter them, I could at least make sure they regretted it. The camp was a 2 hour drive out of town, somewhere deep in the woods, and it looked exactly as expected. Rows of log cabins lined the edge of a clearing, all of which were identical, with brown wood, green roof, and little porches with wooden creaky benches. There was a big open field set in the middle, probably meant for trust falls or group prayers or whatever foolishness these Jesus freaks were into. There was also a withered volleyball net, already sagging, and a line of picnic tables that looked like they hadn't been wiped down for years. The chapel sat at the far end, a simple rectangular shape, painted white, with narrow windows, and an unforgiving iron cross that caught the sunlight like it was catching fire, and a bell that hung silently above the entrance. Everything smelled like pine needles and damp wood, with a hint of some lavender cleaning product they'd used to make the place seem fresh. We'd only been at camp for a few hours when Father Malcolm Reyes gathered us all around the fire for a sermon. The sun was gone, and in its place hung a heavy dark sky, filled with stars that didn't twinkle as much as watch. Father Reyes was one of the people from church I was familiar with, as my mother had repeatedly invited him over for dinner ever since she found Jesus. He was a gray haired man in his late 50s, his thick white beard trimmed close, his large blue eyes unusually clear and intense. Every word he spoke seemed to move through his hands, which gestured with a kind of theatrical conviction, like he was always halfway between a sermon and a song. Around me, the things sung in low, uncertain voices. Their tones were fragile, barely audible above the crackling fire. The lyrics felt too heavy for them, like borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit. I wasn't singing as I sat behind Father Malcolm, slouched on a log, half awake and staring into the darkness of his robe. His voice and the fire had a way of lulling you into this uneasy calm, and my eyes were starting to close. And then, unexpectedly, and out of nowhere, one of the older boys erupted into screams as he fell to the ground. His loud and sharp shrieks sounded as if he were being dragged into the fire, his body convulsed as he mumbled in gibberish. The circle broke, campers and counselors stumbled to their feet, their heads whipping around for the priest's signal. He calmly got up, determined, and began praying, blurting out words of worship to the teenager below his feet, while we watched, holding our breath in anticipation. And then, suddenly, the boy stopped shaking and burst into a deafening laughter. His friend, sitting next to him, joined in. I too chuckled as the priest's face hardened. And that was how I met Josh, the one person who might have hated camp more than me. Josh and I clicked right away, and with his friend Rob, the three of us quickly became inseparable. He was 16, tall and slender, always wearing a black sleeveless shirt with some band logo no one recognized. His boots were always scuffed, and his fingernails always had dirt under them, like he'd been digging through something he shouldn't. Hanging out with the two of them made me feel cooler, and the way they often trolled Father Malcolm fed my religious rage. I started skipping morning masses to tag along whenever they went on a smoke, and even tried some occasionally. Listened to dark metal music under the swing behind the chapel, and got caught reading adult magazines and sneaking out during lights out. I should have noticed, however, that their darkness extended way beyond the casual edginess of teenagers. I should have known by the way they drew disturbing things in the margins of their workbooks, figures with wings made out of knives, priests with bloody eyes, and children walking into fire. Or by the way they often joked about hurting animals, and sometimes even people. It was on the first weekend, and during one of those nature walks, that things finally peeled open. We were in the back of the group, as usual. Josh, Rob, and me. The rest of the campers were up ahead, their voice drifting through the trees like smoke. The path wound past the lake, and when we reached the edge, Josh nudged me and said, "Come on, we're heading off for a smoke." He didn't ask, he never really did, but I always obediently followed. We slipped away past the brush and into the thicker woods. At first, it felt like every other time, us muttering dirty jokes and curse words while pretending we were too cool for mass or anything holy. But as we dove deeper into the woods, something shifted. The two of them weren't walking beside me anymore. They slowed down, and I could hear their footsteps behind mine, soft and irregular, as if they were creeping barefoot over dry leaves. Every time I turned, they were staring at me, not directly, but enough to make it seem as if I interrupted something. When I asked what was up, George just smiled and said, "Nothing, man, relax." But it didn't feel like nothing. The path kept climbing, the woods kept getting darker as the sun dipped behind the hill. We finally emerged at a ridge, an old, rocky cliff that dropped into a dry ravine, and below us, bamboos and twisted roots clung to the walls like veins. The wind had picked up, brushing the trees with a sound like whispering. Josh walked to the edge. Rob lit up a cigarette. No one said anything for a long time. I stepped forward to look. The sunset turned the sky into a bleeding smear of orange and red, casting long shadows across the dirt. Then, before I could process what was happening, I felt a hand on my back. I was shoved hard, and the ground immediately gave way. The fall wasn't long, but it felt endless, and when I hit the rocky, hard ground, pain bloomed across my leg, white hot and pulsing. I screamed for my dear life, called out their names. I told them I couldn't move, that I must have broken something, but there was nothing but silence above. Then there was a muffled chuckle. Josh's voice followed soon after. "Hang tight," he said. "I'll go get help." But something about his tone told me not to expect any, and as I lay there, listening, I heard their whispers, not like before. This time it was hushed and frantic, like they were deciding on something. Then Rob shouted, "We're coming down, okay? Just hang tight." Something in me, some instinct, older than reason, told me to move. So I started crawling, pulling myself along the floor of the raven, leg throbbing, hands grabbing at moss and roots. Dirt filled my mouth, my arms trembled. I didn't know what I was running from. Not really, only that I had to. And then I heard it, footsteps on stone. Josh was now climbing down, fast and light. He was catching up to me. His voice called out behind me, cold as poison. "Where you going, man? I said we were coming to help. Come on, don't be weird." I turned back, just enough to see his face. He was grinning wide, like a madman, and my heart sank. I began crawling harder, hyperventilating, unable to breathe, tears silently rolling down my cheeks. And that's when I saw them, across the Raven, on the trail above, two counselors walking back from the other direction. I screamed like something was being torn out of me. Josh froze mid-step, eyes snapping towards the sound, and then he just backed off, disappearing behind the thick trees. The counselors helped me back, carried me through the woods like a wounded animal. The nurse called my mom, and I was sent home early, like in a splint, fried in pieces. I tried telling them what happened, that Josh, or maybe Rob, one of them had pushed me, that I wasn't supposed to fall, that something was deeply wrong with these two. But no one listened. Father Malcolm had already talked to my mom and told her that I'd been acting out and disrespecting authority, falling in with older, morally confused boys, that I'd probably wandered off and gotten myself hurt trying to impress them. I didn't go back the next summer. My stepdad said I'd learned my lesson, that my spiritual growth no longer needed intervention. We went to Florida instead. I spent most of that trip in stillness, watching the waves and flinching every time someone walked behind me. But when we got back, there was news. Josh and Rob had done it again. This time, they used the long kitchen knife, snuck into Father Malcolm's cabin, and repeatedly stabbed him in the chest. Father Malcolm was declared dead upon arriving at the hospital, but that wasn't the end of the story. It came out later that Josh wasn't just some random troubled teen, that he was Father Malcolm's abandoned son. He must have held a grudge against the church for taking the one parent he had left, fell into some deep, dark rabbit hole about human sacrifice and the occult, and decided he'd become the total opposite of his evangelical father. I think about it now. The first time I saw these two boys interrupting worship and thought they were something to aspire to, and I wonder if they had already decided to sacrifice me by then. And at what point did Josh opt to go for his father instead? I am still grateful to those counselors for being at the right place that day. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them, and I haven't trusted older boys who befriended younger ones ever since. I believe most psychopaths come with a warning sign. It should do you good if you pay attention.